Bring me my money.
Get this money. Where's the money?
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's topic of how your childhood is showing up in your fridge. I'm not in Arizona anymore. I'm back in the Bay Area with my very good friend, Shannon. How are you doing, Shannon?
Good. I'm good. I'm good. It's kind of nice out today. It's not like we had like a couple of weeks of a crazy heat wave, but now it's like high 70s, low 80s, which is just perfect. It's just perfect weather.
Yeah, it's nice being back from Arizona. Like yesterday morning, I went for a walk and it was like in the 60s. I was like, wow, it's not a sauna outside.
Right? Right? And can you believe that it's the 1st of July?
Mm-mm. I just noticed that. I mean, I cannot believe it. And then I just noticed that and I just was like, what? And I'm also happy because I love summer. So
Yeah.
so
Yeah. But it's also like it kind of hit me like 6 months of 2024 like have already gone by. Like that's wild to me. Like half of the year is done. But I always like July 1st. First of all, it's Canada's Independence Day, so happy Canada Day to everyone. Um,
oh.
but it's also like the beginning of the second half of the year. It's like we're deep into summer. The weather's really nice. And I think it's a good time to like check in with yourself.
Mhm.
Um, it's always a good time to check in and find out, okay, what am I doing? What am I not doing? What did I say I was going to do, but I didn't do? Why didn't I do it? All of those things, and not to be punitive, but to really like reflect and then reset and kind of continue on with the things that you said you were going to do. Decide if you need to modify them in any way. And then, of course, if you're ditching shit, just get rid of it and move on. If you haven't started stuff, then understand why and get rid of that guilt or any negative feelings you have about it and move on. So I love July 1st. I do. I really do. Also, I'm a Cancer, so
That's right.
yeah,
Yep. That makes sense. Tauruses and Cancers, we get along.
we do. We really do.
My hubby is also a Cancer. His
Okay.
birthday next week.
Oh, my. I love it. I love it. I love
Yep.
it. I love it. So what are we
So,
talking about today?
so today we're continuing our discussion because last time we talked about how our childhood shows up in our bank account. And we were gonna talk about how it also shows up in our fridges, but because we are very chatsies and we have a lot of things to say. And listen, it's good to take up space. So, nothing wrong with that. And what are your thoughts? I know if you had a lot of really insightful things to say last week about how our childhood shows up in our bank accounts. Um, do you want to, yeah, start us off?
Yeah, well, obviously, that's this how your childhood shows up in your bank account is my area of expertise. Like I see this every day. I spend a lot of time exploring it myself with myself and realizing, oh wow, this is what, I thought about money and I thought about business and I thought about, rich people and wealth. I learned a lot of what those thoughts were, obviously, in childhood, and unconsciously brought a lot of those thoughts with me to adulthood, and a lot of them were limiting, right? No fault of anybody else's, but they were really limiting because societally there's a lot of nonsense around money, and we carry a lot of that with us, and it prevents us from actually changing our lives and having a more fulfilling life and using money in a way that can enhance our lives, right? Um, so when I think about how, you know, your refrigerator is a reflection of those same thoughts, that same environment that you grew up in, and all of those things. You know, that's not my area of expertise, but I can see how, you know, even just some of the things we say or teach children about food and about what's healthy and what's good for us. And then we are in this crazy diet culture that we've been in for decades in this country, and living off of this weird North American diet. You can see how anything that you learned in your childhood could really show up today, and you're not even aware of it, right? You're not even conscious of it.
Right.
I think of little things like, oh, you know, you're expected to like clean your plate, like eat everything off your plate, like whatever is served to you, you should eat all of it because there's starving children somewhere in the world. You know what I mean? And these things are good for you, and you should, you know, and how we treat children and their palates, right? The idea is it would be great if we all knew to introduce new foods to children all the time. Your palate's always evolving, it's always changing, but we expect children to like all the things, right? And we're almost like frustrated. Like I think a lot about young parents, and when you have little kids and the frustration that comes along with eating and feeding and dinner time and meal time, and all of that gets wrapped up in the parent, it gets wrapped up in the child, and you just see how that shows up later in life. And so I just think that, you know, even if as a child, obviously you may not be aware of, you know, what's going on. As an adult, if we could just take a step back and think about, okay, how did I respond? Or how did I react? Or what's going on now as a result of the messaging that I received as a child?
Mhm.
And then am I doing anything to either reinforce that messaging if it was positive, or eliminate it and ensure that I'm not continuing that messaging either to myself, or if you have children, to your children as well? Because I
Right.
think that really shows up in your fridge. It shows up in your ability or inability to feel comfortable with food. And then, of course, how you treat yourself, because food is medicine.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's so similar, you know, because last week we talked about, you know, how your parents' stories of money affected you growing up, and how, you know, it's quite easy to see how for us as humans, you know, just growing up, what we were told, like those kinds of food stories, right? Like, you know, people like in our house, you know, we were often told, like, of course, the starving children in Africa thing, but also, if you left any rice in your rice bowl, that each grain of rice would be like a pockmark on the man or woman or a human that you would end up marrying.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of things, right? So it's, you know, cultural, non-cultural, but also that's like family culture.
Hmm.
Um, and so, you know, when you grow up with these stories, right, you carry them into adulthood, and you often think about like, oh, you know, even if something is, I don't know, I've seen this too, right? Like even when something has gone bad, or, you know, oh no, 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 we can't waste it, right? And then you end up with like a stomach ache or something,
Mm.
right? Instead. So it's it's really, it is really fascinating to see this. And, you know, even if it's not your area of expertise, I think, you know, all of us, it's it's so fascinating. It is the one thing that, one of the few things that we get to have a say over in what we put into our mouth. And I recently read this statistic. I don't know if you knew this, and I'm sure you're not surprised because you talk about the North American diet. But the North American, so the supply chain, the food supply chain in the US is made up of 75% ultra processed foods. I mean, that is so insane to me,
Wild.
right? So it's what we're bringing in and what we're putting onto our table combined with what are the stories that we have been told, the food stories and all the things that we have been told as children, we never grow out of that
Mm.
unless you're doing this like work, right? This like mindset work constantly, right? Whether it's for a business, for money, for lifestyle, for our food, right? And it's so fascinating, you know, because I do like one meal a day, OMAD, and you know, it's to reduce inflammation in my body. And I, you know, I had severe knee pain and I don't anymore. And I tried all these diets and it's interesting because the first thing that people will say to me about it is, "Oh, like don't you get hungry? Don't you get
Mm.
hungry? Aren't you hungry?" And it's really fascinating, right? Because that's also the human brain, right? Because again, we're trained, oh, you know, the the way to eat is, you know, 3 meals a day, and they need to look a certain way, and on the plate, they need to look a certain way
At a certain time.
at a certain time,
Mhm.
and if they're not, right, then there's something wrong. And there's something gonna be wrong with you, and it's really bad. Versus now we've got like Ozempic, which that's a whole nother thing. But, you know, this is something that where you can really develop just as much. I know we talked about it. This is coming back now. I know we talked about it last week about creating a neutral relationship with money. And you were like, no, you know, I want us to be able to just talk about money, you know, even before we get to neutral, right? And it's the same thing with food, right? There's so much like emotion tied up with food. It's like even before we get to neutral, like having a really neutral relationship with our body, having a really neutral relationship with food, and not inheriting our parents' relationship with food, right? Especially like if your parents, like mine, grew up in the Depression, like after World War II,
Mhm.
right? Like there's gonna be a lot of different kinds of food mindset. And, you know, now when you go out to restaurants, which is great, but it's like all really bad seed oil, like salt, sugar, and we're like then becoming addicted to that, right?
Mm.
So, anyways, there's a lot here. I could go on, but I think that, um, you know, similar to creating this money mindset, right? It's important to create not just a money mindset that is your own, that you start owning and you start just even thinking about talking about, like you said last week, having these conversations. What might that look like for me if I were to rewrite my money story? And what might that look like for me or even feel like to rewrite my food story?
Mm.
You know, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, as you were talking about the food story, I was thinking about the iterations of the food stories that even my parents had. So, you know, my
Mm,
parents are from, you know, an island in the Caribbean. And so
right.
a lot of the food that they had was like what they would call ground provisions. So, like anything that was grown. And then they would also have a lot of fish. right? So think of a lot of fruits and vegetables and a lot of fish and a
Yeah.
little bit of meat, but that wasn't really a big deal. Like
Right.
sometimes they'd have beef or whatever, lamb or whatever, but or goat or whatever the case may be. But for the most part, and pork, the two. But for the most part, it was fish, right? They had a lot of fish, different kinds of fish. They're on an island, right? And so they had a lot of really fresh food that was cooked fresh every day, none of the fast food stuff that they were introduced to until they, emigrated. And, but they also had a lot of food that came through similar to like soul food in the United States,
Hmm.
slave food. You know what I mean? Things that that they brought with them throughout the generations that they were given the slaves were given the scraps. And they had to get really creative to make this food edible, to make it
Yeah.
taste good, to stretch it, to do whatever they needed to do to
Right.
feed their own families. But a lot of the food was shit, obviously. And
Yep.
so, what ended up happening a lot of the times was it was sweetened or salted or whatever to make it
Fried.
palatable, fried, right? To make it palatable. But
Hmm.
even with that, a lot of those came through as delicacies, even though they were slave foods and poor people's food. And then, you know what I mean? It kind of get caught up in the culture. So some of the iterations even involved a lot of the times I remember my mother is like, we're not eating that anymore. You know what I mean? Like, not because, not because it was, she was like above eating the cultural food, some of those things, but because they were killers. They were adding to hypertension in the community. They were adding to, diabetes in the community. They were adding to these, ailments that could be avoided because, if we were no longer eating those foods and realizing now that, hey, your lifestyle has also changed. When you're eating a salty food in the Caribbean where it's hot and you're drinking water all the time and drinking stuff and moving and walking and da da da, it's very different than when you're living in a place where you're trapped indoors because it's freezing outside for like almost 6 months out of the year. So even that, those modifications and the iterations of the food makes a huge difference. But also realizing that when I think back, there was never a meal prepared without vegetables and salad, like both, like cooked vegetables and a salad. And even though, as a child, you're like, you don't always want the salad, right? You might want pieces of it or things
Yeah.
you like. This was part of the presentation. And this is something that I continue to do. Like there needs to be some sort of greens and some sort of veg and some,
Right.
and it's got to be a pretty big portion of the meal, right? And
Right.
so it's just interesting to think about those iterations, to think about what you've seen in your lifestyle, in your lifetime with food, and how it even changed. Even when I remember when I was really young, what they would make versus as I got older, they started to, continue to assimilate and, getting a little loosey goosey with some of the stuff that they would eat.
Yeah.
That they wouldn't eat before. Like I remember they would sometimes, like they would, like on a Friday, possibly because they're like, I don't feel like making any dinner or whatever. I would get like McDonald's or, KFC or something like that, that they knew I would be thrilled about, but they wouldn't eat it,
Yeah.
right? They wouldn't eat it because they thought it was too salty, too this, it was garbage. And it wasn't like they thought they were feeding me garbage. It was a treat. It's not going to hurt. Once in a blue moon, I'd get it. But I don't know what they ate, but they probably just had a more condensed version of what they would normally eat, something quick.
Right.
And I just think that it's so interesting that now to this day, even with my kids, sometimes I'm like, okay, you guys can get some burgers and I'll still have something else because I just didn't feel like preparing, a full meal for them. But, if you do that once in a blue moon, I don't think it's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that what's happened is our problem in our society now is most of the food is processed, like you said. I know that 75% statistic. So you've got to go out of your way to find whole foods, right? And to find real food is what I used to call it before, like, but real food, you know what I mean? Stuff that's
Yep.
actually that was grown or had parents, but didn't go through a factory.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. That's so good. I love how you're talking about like the history of the food and getting the scraps and you know trying to make it stretch and trying to make it taste better and trying to it's so interesting because I had this client on retreat and who came through in Arizona, and this is out, she's given a testimonial, so it's out in the open.
Mm.
But she came in, her name is LaShawn. She came in to the retreat after a month of eating processed food. And she knew that she was eating processed food and not drinking enough water.
Mm.
And on retreat, like the food is very clean. There's no refined sugar. There's very, very little salt. And if there is salt, it's usually in the form of fermentation. So kimchi that I make in-house or like miso paste, which is like good for us, right? Probiotics.
Right.
And we always have like a different kind of spa water every day, right? So like cucumber, basil, mint, lemon, lime, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was drinking a lot of water. She loved the spa water. And I just would like put it in a jug every morning, leave it out. Well, day 2 of the 3 days, she's like, oh, by the way, in our sharing circle, by the way, I had really bad knee pain coming in and I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to walk up and down the stairs because her room was on the second floor. And I'm like, oh my God, what? You could have, we could have put you into one of the downstairs rooms and, switch with one of the ladies, no big deal. And she's like, well, it's so much better since I've been eating clean and drinking more water. Day 3, she's like, oh, it's almost gone. Day 4, she does the testimonial video and she's like, it's completely gone. The knee pain. Isn't that crazy?
That's wild.
Because pain equals inflammation,
Inflammation. Yeah.
right? So, and I'm not saying that I'm better. Like, I definitely think about, like when even after the ladies were gone, I'm like, oh, I don't need to like get the spa water. It's okay. I'll just drink regular water or whatever, right? But it's just that little switch, right? Of like, I know for your folks, right? The, you're not about deprivation, like of like skipping the lattes.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that little, right? Switch in the mind of like, I can have that and, right? Even like for desserts, people are like, oh, yeah, I can't have, that was one of the things for me because I love desserts. You can still have your dessert and it can be like without refined sugar.
Mm-hmm.
You can use dates, you can use really sweet mangoes, you can use like really fresh, ripe, like summer fruits. Like there's a lot of really great like stone fruits now are coming into season, right?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have to be like, oh, I'm gonna like limit, restrict, right? And then your body is gonna be like, no, I'm not doing that, right? So, it doesn't have to be super difficult. You know, it's like what we always talk about, right? Like it can be really simple. And you
Yeah.
can really just start with just that one little thing, right? Like, oh, I'm just going to add some cucumbers and like I've got rosemary here, like in my dad's backyard. There's like a ton of rosemary, and you know, like rosemary grows like a weed,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's a lot of it. I'm sure he's not missing any of it. In fact, you have to cut it back. So I have like some rosemary in my water,
Mm.
for
Mm-hmm.
example, right? So, you know, it can be really simple, you know, and I think that, you know, then we can start, right? Like filling our fridge and also bank account with, you know, our adult self.
Well, it's funny that you said that about filling the fridge and the bank account, because and
Mm.
you said some really good things there. I think that a lot of the time when we think we don't have time,
Mm,
we start cutting corners, right? And so, oh, I don't need the spa water. I know for me, I would be guilty of saying something like, oh, I don't have the time. And it's
mhm.
like a lot of the time it's like, slow down. Okay. First of all, slow down, right? Cutting up a cucumber, cutting up some strawberries, cutting up some oranges or lemons or limes or whatever the case may be, and putting like we're not saying you have to have all the things in the water. Like keep
Right.
it simple. Like literally this morning, I don't have the picture here in this room with me, but
Yeah.
I cut up some oranges, dropped them in the pitcher, and
Nice.
I'm gonna be drinking that for most of the day, right? Because I was like, oh, I feel like having a little orange juice, in my water. And
Awesome.
ordinarily, if I feel like I'm rushed, if I feel like I have too much to do, if I feel like I don't have the time, I would skip that step, which would then in turn, I probably wouldn't drink as much water. It wouldn't be as enjoyable, and I wouldn't get the benefits of even the vitamin C from the water. You know what I
Right.
mean? So I
Right.
think slowing down is so important. And the keeping it simple part does show up in your bank account, because I know I'm not a big meal prepper, right? Like I don't tell people that you got to spend all day Sunday making 82 meals for the whole week for the whole family or what have you. But I do
Right.
know that if there's a little bit of intentionality behind what you're going to make that week, like if you even
Right.
just have a vague idea of you're
Right.
going to make like three different dishes, and then, for the week, and you
Right.
shop accordingly, you will spend less money, right?
Right.
So I
Right.
know that when I don't have a plan and I just start putting all kinds of random shit in my cart, it's like, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, groceries are so expensive. It's like, well, of course, Nimrod, because you don't know what you're doing. You're like, I don't know. I got this, I forget half the stuff. I have some of the stuff. It's too harem scarum. I spent way more money than if I had just calmed down and sat down and thought about a few meals for the week, bought the required ingredients, and then I would have only bought what I needed. And I love to give my clients that example, because it's also how I approach your money. Like I
Mhm.
only need so much. Now, could I strive to get $100 million? Sure, I guess. I don't know. But why? It's not worth it to me, right?
Mm.
And at the end of the day, when there's things that I want to have and things that I want to do and experiences that I want to share, I don't need that. Now, if you want that, by all means, go for it and know what you're doing in order to get that, and what you're saying no to and what you're saying yes to in order to get that.
Right.
But you have to really think about what is enough. And
Right.
that applies as well when you're like eating, buying food,
Mm.
shopping for groceries. Like, what do you really want? What do you really need? And I find that so many people are like, when people ask, well, how much do I need to retire? And people are like, oh, you can't retire in this day and age without $10 million. It's like, you're being an idiot. Because guess what? Guess what? The average retiree doesn't even have 300,000. And some of them are doing just fine. So I just think that sometimes we go overboard.
Yep.
We need to scale it back a little bit, be more intentional. It's great to have lofty goals, but be realistic for what it is that you want. Don't get caught up. And you'll find that just slowing it down a bit benefits you mentally, physically. I mean, especially when it comes to thinking about what you're going to ingest, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. What was I gonna say? Yeah, no, it makes so much sense because it's also sort of like catastrophization, right?
Mm.
Where our brain,
Oh
will
my-
go and be like, I can never retire. I can, your folks, right? I can
Mhm.
never eat healthy or fast or whatever, my folks, right? And it's like, listen, then people are always like, yeah, but like you eat so healthy. And I'm like, listen, I try and I'm like, I'm like, I love your story about the supermarket because I'm like with with food, like I'll go and like yeah, I'm just gonna like not eat refined sugar and like I'll be good. And then like week 3, which is totally fine. Like I'll be like, I would like some bread.
Chocolate chip
And
cookies.
yeah, and it's not even like, listen, it's not even like, like the healthy bread, because there's like so many like different
Oh
kinds of
yeah.
health breads now, like gluten-free, whole wheat, multi-grain.
Crowded. Yeah.
No, 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 no. It's like white bread. Like the soft Asian
Yeah.
square white bread. That's what I crave. And I'll put like a little bit of butter, not in fact, a lot of butter. A lot of butter. I'll toast it, a lot of butter, and like a little bit of honey or condensed milk. Have you tried this? So good.
Oh, condensed milk.
Yes. And some
I think
cinnamon.
you only know about condensed milk really if you're outside of Canada and the US, because they don't know. They don't know. Condensed milk, it seems to be like everyone else knows the secret of condensed milk. I'm not
Yes.
introducing anybody to it because if you got diabetes, don't even look at condensed milk. But don't even say condensed milk,
Don't
okay?
even don't even Google that shit.
Right. Don't think about it. But that shit tastes so good in so many ways, in so many things.
You know,
But
right?
yeah, but we digress. Yeah, no,
Okay.
I hear you. I mean, because yeah, you do eat really healthy foods, but everything in moderation. Like
Yes.
that's the thing. Everything in
And not
moderation.
and not to like, it's like how you talk about the not cutting out the lattes, right? Like if somebody told me, oh, you have to cut this, or you have to cut that, or you have to do this, I'm gonna like shut down.
Absolutely.
And what are the chances and what's the possibility and the percentage of me actually getting the results that I want? Right? If I were to give, and I know you know this and you do this too with your folks, like if, we were to give our folks like super complicated plan. Here's a like 100,000 page document. Here you go. Here's the strategy to retire or to eat healthy or whatever. Like, is anyone gonna do it?
I wouldn't do it.
I I would not do it. Yeah.
I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it.
Good point.
I
You know,
wouldn't do it because I didn't do it. So
I
I
didn't do
couldn't
it either.
even, yeah, I couldn't even begin to promote that. I couldn't support anyone doing it. I mean, sure, if you want to do that, by all means, go ahead. But that didn't work for me. And I know that a lot of it was haphazard and I lucked out. Some of it was
Mhm.
luck, but and then the other stuff was a really simple strategy. And then I found other opportunities and I embarked upon those. And it took time, but
Right.
it wasn't complicated. No way, because I wouldn't do it.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So, um, shall we like do our one word takeaways? Or is there anything else you want to say?
No, I just think that um I think a lot of people have to go easier on themselves. But I also think that you do have to be intentional. Like you have to have some kind of idea about
Yeah.
where you want to go and how you're going to get there. And
Mhm.
so if you don't know how to get there, if you know where you want to go, but you don't know how to get there, or you've tried multiple times and
Yeah.
you've been unsuccessful, that doesn't mean that you give up. You just need a different strategy.
Yeah.
Whatever it is that you're doing isn't working. It doesn't mean it's not for you. It just means that the strategy that you're utilizing, that you've used, get rid of it and try something else and get some help. I think people really underestimate how much help they need to change, and how much accountability they need. So you need like accountability, you need support, and you need a strategy.
Right.
That's an ASS acronym, accountability, support, and strategy.
You need some ass.
You need some ass. So get
Get
your
some
ass. But yeah, no, but seriously, those are the things that people need, and they really underestimate how much you need, like accountability you need, how much support you need, and then having a proper strategy that works for you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Um, and as someone who has always been really intimidated by the word strategy,
Mm,
I would just add to that, like, let's put a little asterisk on ass. I
mhm,
love that. And say in the bottom part, the fine print, um, all strategy is aligned action.
mhm,
That's it. So when I heard that sort of reframe about strategy, that made a lot more sense to me. And then all aligned action is just like tiny, like what's your next tiniest step? That's all we do on retreat. Like what's your next tiniest thing that you're going to do when you get home, right?
mm,
What's the next tiniest, right? Because if it's like this large, big, involved thing, even if you have your entire like, you know, 20-year plan mapped out, it's going to be, if it feels overwhelming for you, you're not going to do it. If you're not going to do it, you're not going to get the results that you want. And then it's this like weird vicious cycle.
mhm.
So, like back to the fridge, just look in there, see if there's anything that, you're like, oh, this is great. I like this. I'm keeping this, right? In your fridge, if there's something that you're like, oh, that's totally like, not something that I don't know, I want to eat anymore. Like I used to eat these like dark chocolate covered like caramel salt balls from Trader
Mhm,
Joe's.
mhm,
And there is really low, like if you look at, you look at the refined sugar content, it's really low, for what it is. But like I'm like, I don't want to eat those anymore. Like I'm just gonna I'd much prefer to eat fruit, especially because there's so much good fruit in the summer. Maybe I'll return to them in the winter.
mm.
Who knows? That's okay, right? But for now, I don't eat those anymore,
Yeah.
you know?
And that's I love giving yourself permission to be like, maybe I'll come back to it. It's not heroin. So I mean,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
maybe you'll come back to it, and maybe you will, and you're like, nah, I don't like them as much as I thought I did. And
Maybe
that's
not. Yeah.
okay. It doesn't have
Yep.
to be forever, or it
Yep.
can be. Like give yourself a lot of grace and
Yep.
a lot of leeway. And I also like what you said about the strategy. I like that it's an aligned plan. It's a plan, right?
Mhm.
And I think I like to give my plans time, right?
Mhm. Yep.
There isn't a timeline, like a rush, a hustle. It isn't as intense. I like to give it time, and then that's why I keep it really simple too with my clients. Like
Right.
we're building wealth, it takes time.
Mhm.
Yes, there's always that one person that, of course, we societally like to highlight who
Right.
became rich in 3 minutes. But for the most part, this takes time. And the reason why a lot of us don't hit that financial security is because we don't stay the course. We don't have a plan.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah,
The ass.
the ass.
Awesome.
All right. So, folks,
Sounds good. Mhm.
feel free to comment if you please, like, share, subscribe. If you have any comments, if there's something you want to hear us talk about, if there's something here that resonated with you, you want to hear more about it, less of it, whatever the case may be, let us know. And we'll be back next week.
We will.
All right,
Thanks for
folks.
joining us.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Here we go.
Money, money, making crap for money.